So I'm Eilis Ferran, Professor of Corporate and Securities Law at the University of Cambridge, and it is my very great pleasure to be here and to have the opportunity to introduce our very distinguished speaker for this session. So those of you who've looked at the program will know that it asks some big questions of our speaker. So our title is Regulatory Leadership, the US Perspective. And the questions are, what are the vision and priorities of US regulators when it comes to climate change and other major systemic issues? How can regulators enable responsible capitalism? What are the expectations from the transatlantic relationship? We could not do better than have Commissioner Crenshaw here with us today to help us begin to address those questions. Caroline Crenshaw was unanimously confirmed by the US Senate and sworn into office as Commissioner of the US Securities and Exchange Commission on the 17th of August 2020. She came into her role as Commissioner with a wealth of experience as a securities lawyer in private practice, as a currently serving captain in the United States Army Reserve Judge Advocate Corps, and as an SEC staffer. She practiced law in Washington, where she was in a private firm where she represented public companies, broker-dealers, and investment advisors on complex securities law investigations and enforcement matters. She then moved to the SEC, where in addition to working in the Division of Examinations and the Division of Investment Management, Commissioner Crenshaw was also involved in serving as counsel to then serving commissioners in the development of developing proposals to strengthen investor protection in increasingly complex markets. Now, in the official language of the SEC website, Commissioner Crenshaw's commitment to public service and mission brought her to the SEC. I hope she will allow me, however, to use her own words, because I think she puts it better herself in an alumni interview at the from Minnesota Law School, where she said, "I came to this job not just as a securities lawyer, but as a soldier, sister, and new mother. I want to make sure my fellow soldiers, our families, and millions of American families have a fighting chance to achieve the financial futures they deserve." Commissioner Crenshaw, thank you for joining us today. Please take the floor.
Good morning. Can you all hear me? Even way at the back there. All right. It's a pleasure to be here today at the inaugural ECGI Responsible Capitalism Summit. Coincidentally, this is my inaugural trip abroad as a commissioner of the SEC. I came into office in the midst of the global pandemic, so I've not had the opportunity to meet with groups of academics, policymakers, members of industry, and the general public in person. I'm glad to be able to do so now, and I hope to benefit from the ideas and discussions produced at this forum. Thank you to Professor Becht for organizing today's discussions, and to Professor Ferran for that kind introduction. As always, I do have to give the standard disclaimer required by all SEC folks that the views I express today do not necessarily represent those of the Commission, my fellow commissioners, or members of its staff. Now, when I accepted the invitation to this conference, I did not realize that my remarks would precede a Nobel laureate, Professor Oliver Hart. My praises to Professor Becht for putting together such an esteemed group. And I'm pleased to precede Professor Hart, who is here today to discuss his new paper, The New Corporate Governance, co-authored with Professor Zingalis, a highly accomplished professor in his own right, and the author of the renowned book, Saving Capitalism from Capitalists, as well as co-host to a podcast that my staff and I regularly discuss. As I considered how best to contribute to today's discussion, I turned to their work for inspiration. And I hope that I can offer you some interesting perspectives from my vantage point as a U.S. securities lawyer and policymaker. A vantage point that is, admittedly, somewhat narrow in scope, both in terms of geography and specialized subject matter. The mission of the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission is to protect investors, maintain fair, orderly, and efficient markets, and facilitate capital formation. Although that may, at first blush, sound broad, our foundational and authorizing statutes, interpreted by the U.S. judiciary and a near century of agency practice, provide certain bounds to carrying out that mission. This is the perspective through which I read the Hart and Zingales paper. And this is the perspective that I bring to my work as an SEC commissioner. More specifically, this is the lens through which I consider the proposed SEC climate-related disclosure rule that I discussed today. Now, as I read it, Professors Hart and Zingales argue that shareholders are taking a new view of value. The storied Milton Friedman's traditional concept of shareholder value maximization is no longer an optimal view of corporate governance. Instead, investors are aware that today's world is complex, and externalities and interdependence of the world in which companies operate matters. On certain subjects, issuers themselves are likely in the best, least costly position to change corporate behaviors, where shareholders have determined changes should be made. So instead, shareholderism should evolve to what the professors term shareholder welfare maximization. As Professors Hart and Zingales point out, shareholder value maximization is more or less the status of American corporate law. While shareholder primacy was initially articulated by Milton Friedman in his writing, it was then accepted in seminal cases by the specialized chancery courts in the U.S. state of Delaware, where many businesses are incorporated. Concepts like stakeholderism, shareholder welfare maximization, or a reformation of the corporate purpose are all thoughtful and important ideas, and I look forward to discussing them at forums such as this one. That being said, I feel important to be unequivocal on this point. Such concepts, a repurposing of the corporate form, or promoting new forms of capitalism, are actually not part of the SEC's proposed rulemaking on climate-related disclosures. Neither are social issue concerns, environmental regulation, or environmental policymaking. So what's the proposal about? From my perspective, I'll go through what the purpose of the SEC's proposed rule on climate-related disclosures is, why I voted to propose it earlier this year, and oddly enough, spend some time discussing what this proposed rulemaking is not about. I'll start with some background. The rule the SEC proposed, if adopted, would seek both qualitative and quantitative disclosures about climate-related risks and opportunities, and disaggregated climate-related risk impacts to existing line items in the audited financial statements. More specifically, these disclosures would include discussion of the company's assessment and management of climate-related risks and opportunities, along with greenhouse gas emissions. The staff and the commission, as required under U.S. administrative law, are now carefully and thoroughly reviewing the data, views, and arguments submitted in response to the proposal. This proposal, as many do, elicited a diverse set of commenters with varied ideas and perspectives. Public companies, private companies, accountants, lawyers, academics, and investors of all stripes, individual, pension, institutional, have written to provide their feedback. That feedback will be taken into account and will shape the final rule. This is how administrative procedure in the United States was designed to work. Now, the SEC, like all U.S. agencies, has a specific remit. Advancing that remit and operating within the confines is an obligation the SEC takes seriously in every one of its regulatory actions. Accordingly, these disclosures are not designed to move markets or impact climate change. But investors are increasingly seeking and using climate-related information. Public and private funds, asset managers, index providers, among others, have demanded information on financial risks and opportunities related to climate so they can fulfill their disclosure, fiduciary, or other obligations to investors. In other words, investors turn to these data to help inform their investment decisions. Professors Hart and Zingales focus on shareholder proposals, which is another key indicator of investor demand for climate-related disclosures. In the 1970s, shareholder support for Exchange Act Rule 14a8 advisory proposals that addressed social or environmental matters was roughly 3%. During the 2021 proxy season, shareholders submitted 115 proposals addressing climate and climate-related reporting. Of those that were not withdrawn, the proposals received, on average, 62% of the votes. What's more, the number of environmental proposals withdrawn provides evidence of successful shareholder engagement, as issuers tend to engage with shareholder proponents rather than take the proposal to a vote. This, of course, captures a very broad spectrum of shareholder engagement, in the sense that proposals call for a range of solutions, some having to do with reporting and others having to do with various targets and goals. Although the resolutions may have different points of focus collectively, these shareholder proposals indicate investor demand for climate information through direct investor expression. Separately, surveys of a broad range of asset managers and other investor initiatives that range in specificity and detail provide additional evidence of the breadth and depth of shareholder demand and need for climate-related information. And the SEC's climate-related disclosure proposal details investor demand from myriad and diverse sources, an evidentiary record that presents a common through line. Investors want to understand climate-related information because those risks relate to companies' operations, financial condition, and prospects. And as I think through how I can support the SEC's critical mission to protect investors, maintain fair, orderly, and efficient markets, and to facilitate capital formation, I look to the record of investor use and investor demand, and for demand for information as a guiding principle. Examples of agency precedent are also relevant. Looking to the past can help us understand what falls within the bounds of ordinary course disclosure, even if a particular type of disclosure is not specifically enumerated in a statute. And there is certainly precedent for the type of disclosure and the process for rulemaking that we have undertaken regarding climate-related disclosures. This proposal has not been advanced on a whim or an impulse. We have engaged in careful, calibrated, deliberate process that includes decades of market observation, guidance to the industry, a request for input, and now a proposed rule. This is similar to the process the SEC has used to address other market developments over its history. For example, in the 1960s and 70s, the agency undertook to investigate, study, and draft rules related to hot issues. Here, the Commission observed a period of general optimism and speculative interest in certain IPOs, which were called hot issues or issuances. In recognizing this trend, the SEC teamed up with a third party, the National Association of Securities Dealers, to form a task force to examine concerns related to these offerings. The Commission held fact-finding hearings and developed a robust understanding of the relevant questions. Informed by this work, the Commission identified a disclosure gap and engaged in notice and comment rulemaking to amend registration statements and periodic reports. The goal? To require meaningful disclosure to investors that ranged from management information to the status of new product development to general competitive conditions, and in the case of certain registrants offering securities for the first time, a description of their plan of operation. As the Commission stated when it proposed the rule, a recurring phenomenon has resulted in disorderly markets and damage to public investors. So the Commission acted. In doing so, it noted that, quote, Congress, in enacting the federal securities statutes, created a continuous disclosure system designed to protect investors and to assure the maintenance of fair and honest securities markets. And that continuous disclosure system is evident throughout our current rulebook. We require disclosure of information relating to litigation and other business costs arising out of the compliance with federal, state, and local laws that regulate the discharge of materials into the environment or otherwise relate to the protection of the environment. Other disclosures range from feasibility studies and technical reports relating to mining operations, and disclosures, regardless of specific materiality determinations, relating to directors' backgrounds and qualifications. These are but a few examples of mandatory disclosures promulgated under the SEC's statutory authorities. These have been utilized time and time again for an array of disclosures implemented through the fact-finding process of administrative law. Many of you may be thinking that reading Professors Hart's and Gonzalez paper is akin to an action-packed murder mystery when hearing me quote a 50-year-old securities regulation. And you are not wrong. But I felt it's important to highlight, as it informs the exercise we're undertaking today. A rule proposal that is part of the SEC's oversight of corporate disclosure, designed to provide investors with information they are demanding in order to allocate their capital and decide how to vote. In the current case, it's about climate-related disclosures. The SEC's proposal on the matter, as noted, identified gaps in the disclosure in the voluntary climate risk reporting regime. And after decades of staff experience, a thorough dialogue with the public through then acting Chair Lee's request for input, and now through the notice and comment rulemaking process, the SEC is seeking to ensure that the continuous disclosure system is responding to investors. Simply put, the current climate proposal is squarely within the SEC's remit to promulgate disclosure rules for the protection of investors. In the time since the proposal, there have been demonstrably false assertions that the SEC is acting as an environmental regulator, is seeking to decarbonize the economy, and is crossing a line in terms of its authority with this type of regulatory action. As a factual matter, the proposed rulemaking concerns disclosure of information by public companies concerning climate-related risks and opportunities. It neither usurps a board's business judgment, nor does it seek to nudge behavior into a normative outcome, regulate the environmental impact of companies, or restructure the capital markets. Rather, it seeks to provide disclosures investors are demanding. Again, work that the SEC has been doing for decades to protect investors and fulfill all elements of its tripartite mission. From my perspective, whether the investors are allocating capital to companies that are pursuing aggressive carbon reduction or selecting companies that have high emissions is irrelevant to the rationale articulated in the proposal, because, yet again, achieving certain environmental impact is not part of the rationale. As I wrote in my statement when the SEC voted to approve the proposal, it's not my job as a commissioner to dictate to shareholders what they should want. When it comes to the U.S. disclosure rulemaking's framework and program, my approach is to exclude normative biases of how the world outside my remit ought to be, and ground myself in the law, precedent, and a near century of SEC practice and issuer and investor input. Now, the motivation for the climate-related disclosure proposal is not just about what investors are demanding from the SEC. While investors and others wait for the SEC to take final action, the market has evolved. Climate-related disclosures and strategies exist and are used by companies today. Companies are shifting from gas to electric, making claims that becoming carbon neutral, and advertising their eco-friendliness. Climate-related management and risk strategies are being disclosed, and such strategies exist on a spectrum, from those seeking investments that pursue emissions reduction strategies to those that deliberately pursue high emissions or otherwise anti-ESG strategies. The staff have observed that between 2019 and 2020, 33% of all annual reports contain disclosure related to climate change. Academic studies have found that the majority of the Russell 3000 firms provide climate-related information, and the extent of the information in voluntary disclosures has increased. Additionally, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's Center for Capital Markets Competitiveness conducted a survey finding that over half of U.S. public companies have been publishing corporate social responsibility, sustainability, ESG, or similar reports that include climate-related information, with emissions being one of the most discussed topics in these reports. And I'm only skimming the surface. Companies are also setting targets and goals. Reports have noted that 2/3 of S&P 500 companies have established a target for carbon emissions. And beyond emission targets and tracking, more companies are making pledges to other green goals, such as using more renewable energy, using different materials, and monitoring emissions on a more granular level than ever before. In many ways, climate-related strategies are being marketed to consumers and the public, including to investors and prospective investors. The markets have moved. The markets are disclosing this information. But there's a problem. The disclosures are made with varying degrees of specificity, standardization, and sometimes with unreliability. Investors have said they do not have the ability to understand and track how strategies are being implemented. Meanwhile, the location of these disclosures is quite literally all over the place, making comparability a major challenge. It is important the SEC and investor protection not be left behind as the markets surge ahead. It is the SEC's job to help ensure that investors have adequate information and that companies can be held accountable for the information they are providing to investors and that investors use to make investment decisions. Regardless of the topic, companies need to be accountable for claims they make to investors. The SEC seeks to provide standardization of disclosures, and we turn to the investors, markets, and the administrative process in order to keep the disclosure and reporting framework current and meaningful. And finally, there's one last point that I would like to make using a timely example. It has to do with the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, or the ACT. The Act was signed into law this past August, and I think it helps illustrate why investors are seeking climate-related information and how that need may become even greater. As you all know, climate risk for firms is often thought of as two different types of risk, transition and physical. The Act is potentially significant because it includes incentives for households and companies to transition to lower carbon practices. The flip side of transition risks, transition opportunities. Specifically, the Act creates incentives through tax credits, grants, loans for entities to engage in clean electricity and fuel projects, lower emitting transportation, building and equipment efficiency, carbon capture, and related manufacturing and supply chains to support this. Overall, the Act incentivizes business and individual consumers to utilize lower emission products and services, which should affect demand. As with most new laws, many of the details of implementation remain. However, observers have begun to note that the Act definitely changes the narrative from risk mitigation to opportunity to capture. Some companies will be better positioned than others to capitalize on the opportunities presented. A company's ability, or lack thereof, to capitalize on these incentives is an example of the transition opportunity and risk that I just mentioned, and could impact returns, could have an impact on returns. When markets start to shift to alternative products, processes, and energy production, whether because of this statute, other governmental actions, or dynamics that have nothing to do with the government, companies that do not respond deftly may suffer competitively or incur other losses. This is a textbook example of transition risk. Climate-related disclosures can help investors understand how effectively companies are responding to the financial opportunities and risks the Act and the markets creates, and how well positioned they are to respond to other opportunities and risks that may arise in the future. Before I wrap up, I'd like to stress that we have arrived at this point after decades of relevant experience and work with investors and issuers, as well as fiduciaries that invest money on behalf of investors, workers, parents, teachers, retirees. As you heard earlier, prior to becoming a commissioner, I worked at the staff of the SEC for almost a decade. I believe in the work of the commission, and I believe in and support the work of our capital markets. I know that the SEC is committed to fulfilling the agency's mission with integrity and faithfully implementing the statutory authorities promulgated by Congress. The SEC has a long and storied history of protecting investors by providing a reliable framework of reporting and disclosure. I also have enough awareness and humility to note that not everything the SEC does is perfect. That, however, is the beauty of the notice and comment rulemaking process. I want all investors, issuers, investment advisors, and other stakeholders to know that they should and can come to the SEC and talk with us at any time, and that the comment letters we receive are carefully reviewed and considered. And while I'm here, I want to thank the professors and academics who have dedicated their research to the topics discussed today. I look forward to your continued work. It informs everything we do, and thank you for having me.
So we now have a good amount of time for discussion, which I'm sure will be lively. So as before, we'll take questions in the room, and if there are questions coming through on Slido as well, we will keep an eye on those and feed those into the discussion. If I may kind of use the privilege of the chair just to sort of kick off the discussion. In a recent ECGI working paper, Alex Edmonds of the London Business School argues that ESG is simultaneously really important and nothing special. And the nothing special phrase came to my mind when I was listening to you, because if I understand you correctly, you were essentially saying that what you're doing here is what the SEC has been doing throughout its history, bringing the benefits of specificity, standardization, facilitating comparability. So essentially supporting the market that already has shown that there is a big demand for this type of information, but it's producing a cacophony of different disclosures that everyone's finding it really hard to navigate. So I get that, and I understand that, and it's consistent with what the SEC does. But then it sort of leads into thinking about, well, what do investors want, and how do you figure that out? And you talked about the data and the process that you use. But I wondered if I might just specifically focus on this concept of materiality and what's material to investors. Now, I've read some of the commentary in the US, so I know you're walking a bit of a tightrope, sort of internally, some people saying that you're playing fast and loose with materiality, you're ignoring it in places, or in other places you're making it difficult to apply because you've decoupled it from the financial context. And if you look at that with a European sort of perspective, you think, goodness, it's a very different debate, now quite firmly embedded in European thinking and in European law is the sort of double materiality and the idea that investors want corporate sustainability information based on double materiality, because that's the way that they will be able to make better investment decisions, and that's what they know consumers want. So my question is really a two-parter. Number one, could you just reflect a little bit further on the US debate, domestic debate about materiality and how you're thinking on that within the SEC? And then secondly, insofar as there is a divergence here between the US and the EU in thinking about what disclosures are appropriate, what that means for the goal of standardization at the global level.
Yeah, sure. Happy to discuss. So I will start by saying the debate is an active one on the rule and materiality, as you mentioned. But I think there's a couple of important points. First, not every disclosure in the U.S. Requires a materiality prerequisite, a materiality predicate or qualifier. And so there are disclosures throughout our required disclosures throughout our regime that do not have this materiality qualifier. So that's one point. The other point is, the definition of materiality in the U.S. comes from the Supreme Court. In an essentially high level, and someone here I'm sure will give me, will correct me on the exact language, but the essence of it is it's information that will go to the total mix of investors' decision in whether or not to invest. And it goes to the total mix. There is, in that definition, no financial qualifier. Some folks, I think, really, maybe perhaps non-lawyers, but even lawyers in the U.S. and certain folks, I think, find that perhaps dissatisfying. It's hard to know, then sort of what is material. And I think, for me, that is exactly the point, and that is the grounding of the investor demand, of the market movement. And our job is to protect investors and to maintain fair and orderly and efficient markets. And if there are disclosures, if there are promises that investors cannot determine whether or not they're accurate, I think we have a problem in the markets. I think that leads to perhaps a question about the honesty of the markets, which was a quote from the Commission in the 60s and 70s. So I think that is the way I am looking at this. And as you said, we have a cacophony of data and disclosures, and investors really can't use that. That is what they have said. So this is not a one-off investor coming to us saying, this is necessary for my investment decisions. This really is, I would say, a complete and long-term request from investors. And so that's how I'm thinking about it. On the convergence point, I think it's an important one. I think to the point of comparability, we want to have some system that investors can compare globally. And I think that is a challenge that I think the EU, the US, the ISSB, the UK are all working through right now, and I think that's where the ISSB will hopefully play an important role in helping with that dialogue and helping find a baseline that can be built off of, but one that does provide a really comparable set of disclosures at the base level.
Thank you for that. So I'm now opening up to the room. I can immediately see a hand sort of getting up. Please do introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you. Cynthia Williams from Osgood Hall Law School. I certainly commend what the SEC has done. This is a topic I've written on for many years, but I'm wondering if there was or is any concern about this rule, once it's promulgated, pushing more public companies into the private market. And in discussing that, I'd be really very interested in what the SEC, or your views, I know you're speaking only for yourself, your views about the policy implications of the fact that we have far fewer public companies in the United States today than 20 years ago. Thank you.
I think it's an important question. For me, I am not convinced that this rule will drive. I think there's all sorts of reasons why companies choose to be private rather than public in the U.S. I don't think, this rule is going to be a massive driver into the private markets if, when and if it is passed. I don't think it would be the only reason, but I think you raise a very important point, and that is this shift to the private markets from the public markets, and it's something I have been doing a lot of thinking about, and I actually have a call to academics to do some work on as well. I did a speech on that a couple months ago. But I really wonder, over the past several years, the Commission has released several rules designed to help small companies with this on-ramp to go public. I don't know whether they've had their intended effect. It seems to me that we have not had a shift to all of these smaller companies going public. And we also have the massive question of the massive companies, the unicorns that are staying private. So I think there's sort of two separate questions embedded in what I just said. But I think the SEC really does need to think about whether the current structure is working, and whether we need to think through other possible proposals that might impact this proposal, whether that's a 12G, addressing 12G that one of my colleagues, Commissioner Lee, has talked about in a speech, whether it's looking at our Reg D exemptions, which was really designed for private, smaller companies as an on-ramp. But a lot of companies don't even file a form on Reg D. We really don't have those data, and so that's certainly something I am interested in. So I really think we do need to think holistically about both the on-ramp options, the IPOs, the SPACs, the direct offering, the direct listings, as well as whether the structure and the rules that have been put into place the past sort of 8 to 10 years have worked, or whether that has actually just increased the number of companies in the private markets rather than encouraging them to go public.
I'm looking for, yep.
Patrick Bolton. I think you framed the proposal extremely well to avoid what happened to the EPA, and I think that was, I thought, very important. First, before I ask my question, I want to just quickly react to the earlier question, pointing out that more disclosure for listed companies, it doesn't necessarily cut in the way that it makes it more attractive to be non-listed. Because one reason why you have this non-listed space, it attracts investors who are able to get the information in other ways. And it's because you don't have a level playing field. And disclosures go in the direction of level playing field. So I think that's important framing. But to my question, the carbon disclosures, to what extent should they be audited if they're mandated? And where do you go in terms of the auditing requirements?
So that the piece of the proposal that's in the financials that would require auditing elicited, I will say, significant comment, to say the least. And it's certainly something I don't know where we'll go. As I mentioned, we take into account quite carefully all of the comment letters, all of the feedback we get. And again, that area received a significant amount of feedback. So I don't know what will move forward there. The 1% requirement in and of itself in the proposal really got a lot of attention. So maybe that's an area that maybe there's flexibility. But I think it goes back to the point that Professor Ferran was making at the beginning. I mean, this really isn't something out of the ordinary, and this does impact the financials. And to the degree it does, auditing serves an important purpose. So I think that's sort of the lens that I am thinking about it through as we continue to assess the comment file and figure out how best to move forward.
I'm going to feed in one of the questions from Slido at this point. It's from a PhD student, so and I'm really pleased that we have some PhD students contributing here. And it's broader. as a question. So it's about kind of how we understand fiduciary duty. So perhaps also drawing on your background as a securities lawyer, and the persistence of this idea of fiduciary duty being one that US law requires maximization of shareholder value. So why does it persist?
Why does it persist? I think years and years of U.S. law is why it persists. Has it shifted in what exactly was originally? And in the U.S. it's complicated because there's different fiduciary duties, and it get into public company fiduciary duties, investment advisor fiduciary duties, broker dealers. Broker dealers, in fact, have a best interest requirement, not actually a fiduciary duty. So the law is, I would say, in place and requires that we follow it, but maybe not optimally developed at this point. And maybe the interpretations of it certainly should be considered. And that's where the SEC staff, again, we have to follow precedent. So we cannot change the law. But certainly we look at interpretations from time to time and how the staff has interpreted various obligations. I think we looked at it in terms of the investment advisor fiduciary duty when we were passing the rules for broker dealers on regulation best interest to make those standards more equivalent. And so it's something we continually look at and think about. But again, we do have to follow the law, and I think that probably is to some degree part of it. But I would say that it's certainly something we're always thinking about, and whether there's room for revised interpretations and how we are seeing and assessing the fiduciary obligations.
Great. So back to the room. Question here.
There was.
Oh, I think there might be one up. I'll take one up there and then come down.
Thank you. Karel Arnaud from CEPS, a think tank here in Brussels. Thank you for an excellent speech. Very good, very clear, probably a bit clearer than what we hear here in Brussels about taxonomy. But that's a side comment. If you will check companies' disclosure on environmental standards, what is the benchmark against which you will measure? If a company says we are achieving our road with now 50% towards net zero, how will you check net zero? What is net zero? And what is your thinking about the work of the International Sustainability Standards Board? Will you refer to their standards? Thank you.
So to get in as many questions as possible, I'm going to group a few. So we had,
Okay.
and there's two on this side, so we take three, you and then the gentleman 2 rows behind you.
Great. I'm John Zitnik. So I wanted to ask about something completely different. My recollection, and I'm a little bit jet lagged, is the SEC also has a proposal to change how mutual funds disclose their votes on environmental matters and others. So I was wondering if you could speak to that a little. I'm curious about what your views are and where that stands.
Hi. I'm Carmine Di Noi. I'm the Director of Financial Enterprise Affairs at the OECD and former Commissioner at Consul. No, 2 questions, if Eilis allows, and you, Commissioner. No, one, I would say, put it together, the first 2 questions. I mean, one thing, I'm coming actually from the IOSCO annual meeting where we discussed exactly IOSCO OECD on public and private markets and incentives and disincentives. Now, it's true, 30,000 companies delisted from 2005 in global markets, but not everywhere. I mean, Asian markets have been always very vital. So the topic, markets are global, and markets on these kind of issues are even more global. So isn't there the risk, I mean, you mentioned something very quickly, but we really need global standards here. It's true that we need sometimes leaders, and so in some cases Europe is pushing others. But then if leaders, there are then no followers, they are not leaders anymore. So the risk is to push companies maybe out or to push companies only on some markets. This is the first thing. The second thing is just a smaller one, but you mentioned there are many shareholder proposals for companies to adopt also greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals. Now, these are, by definition, in a more long-term and maybe not credible. So what maybe securities regulators can do to improve the situation, or even in this case, we need maybe some sort of global guidelines. Thank you, Commissioner.
Okay, so net zero, mutual funds, and then Maria's questions.
Yeah, Professor Ferran's giving me a real challenge here, trying to remember all three of the questions. So first, how do we ensure that the promises that they're made are achieving sort of the net zero emissions, if I understand that question correctly? And I think that is part of why the proposal and the rules that we have put out would be so important, because it would require issuers to give us information, and investors, information about how they intend to achieve those promises. And I think to the degree they don't, and to the degree we have evidence they don't, that's where our enforcement division comes in. If they are misrepresenting, if they are lying, if they have no plan, that's where our division of enforcement will come into play. And that's a piece of why this, for me, is important to the integrity of the markets, and why it is time for the SEC to move forward with a proposal. It's not exactly anti-fraud, but it's really capturing sort of this misrepresentation and really ensuring the integrity of the markets. And so that is one of the important parts of the rules, to require disclosure so that we can confirm whether or not, and investors can confirm, and investors can decide if this plan is totally this doesn't seem like a good plan, then they can opt not to invest in that company. So it's a compilation, or a whole sort of broad effort that would require everybody. We obviously don't have the resources on our own to police the entire markets. So I think that was the first question, and maybe I got happy to chat afterwards if I missed pieces of it. To Professor Zitnick's question, yes, we have a proposal out that would require disclosure of shareholder of the votes, form NPX, for those of you who are following this closely. It is in the works. I think one of the things that I would certainly be interested in is how often that we disclose those votes. I think right now it is annually. I do think that maybe investors would be interested to know sooner rather than later how the funds that they are invested in are voting on some of these proposals. So certainly that's something we are considering and taking under advisement and figuring out, given the notice and comment rulemaking, how best to move forward. Again, don't know if I completely answered your question, but happy to discuss it afterward. And then the last question was ISSB and global. I think it's important to work together. I think I can't speak on behalf of all the SEC, but I know that we are actively involved with discussions in the ISSB, and it's my understanding that they are moving forward, and quite frankly, at a pace that impresses me. When they first put out the timeline, I didn't think they would ever be able to meet the times they set out for themselves, but it does seem like they're working toward that. And I think that's really important. Does it work perfectly with the timeline in the US and the timeline in the EU? Probably not. And that's where sort of the leaders and the followers are going to have to come into to play. But I think I'm optimistic that all of the regulators will work together to come up with a framework that will work at least as a baseline for everybody, and then the individual countries or regulatory bodies can move forward off of that with various things. But it's certainly important to me to achieve that level of comparability, and I know we are working very closely with the ISSB with that in mind.
I have a great question from the slide. Do we have time to depend on disclosure?
Well, whether or not I want that to be up to me, as sort of I discussed, it's unfortunately not. That is outside the remit in my current job. Separately, I think it's a problem that corporations are seeing. I think that's why the markets have moved. I think it's something that investors are seeing. That's why they're demanding information. Do we have time? For all of our sakes, and as a parent, I hope that as a society, we make the right decisions, that we make selfless decisions, and that we can move forward effectively. But I think in terms of my SEC remit, I think that's actually outside the scope, and that we will move with, as fast as we can because of the markets and because of investors.
Yeah, I think that's a question we might ask some of the panels this afternoon to return to as well. I think we're at time, or so. I think it's always a sign of a great paper that it leaves you wanting to ask more questions than there is time for. I mean, one of the things that I took away as well was your reference to you're not intending to nudge behavior. So the interrelationship between disclosure and behavior change, I think, would be a fascinating topic. But for another day, Commissioner Crenshaw, again, I would just, on behalf of everyone here and on behalf of the ECGI, like to thank you. We know how busy your schedule must be, so finding time to come and be with us and to share your thoughts so generously with us, we're incredibly grateful, so thank you.